You probably heard it many times, but it's that Russia and Ukraine are in the headlines recently, and for unfortunate reasons. Additionally, Russia and Ukraine have been at odds in Crimea and Donbass. But this raises the question, why? Why are Ukraine and Russia hostile neighbors? Well, the ongoing status of Crimea and pro-Russian separatists in the Donbass region may indicate that Russia and Ukraine are inevitably going to be hostile to each other. But the reality is a lot more complicated. It stems from geopolitics and history. Speaking of history, Russia and Ukraine share a very long history and interaction, which is a factor in the current state of affairs. It all stems from Kievan Rus. This polity of several Rus states shaped Russia and Ukraine's history. But when the Mongol nation attacked, Kievan Rus managed to disintegrate. It was at this point that the history of today's Russia and Ukraine would diverge. Much of today's Ukraine came under the control of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and later the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Meanwhile, Moscow would eventually rise to power and absorb the remaining Rus states, giving birth to the Tsardom of Russia. One thing that Russians and Ukrainians can relate to is Cossacks, specifically the predominantly East Slavic group of people who love horses and wander across the Eastern European steppes. The Cossacks living in Poland and Lithuania weren't exactly keen on Polish rule, and eventually they rebelled and they wished to stay closer to Russia. Eventually, much of Ukraine would be gradually absorbed into the Russian Empire, with only a small portion, which is Galicia, going to Habsburg Austria. However, in the 18th century, the Cossack host was forcibly disbanded by the Russian Empire, relocating most of them to the Kuban region. The Russian Empire saw Ukrainians as ethnically Russian as well as Belarusians. They referred to them as Little Russians. The Ukrainian language and literature were suppressed mainly to prevent the rise of Ukrainian nationalism and to Russify the Little Russians, and higher rates of Russification were observed in eastern Ukraine and the so-called Novorossiya, or New Russia, which makes this region a lot more Russian than the western parts of Ukraine. Despite the St. Petersburg government denying the notion that Ukrainians are distinct from Russians, there are still several Ukrainian nationalists who wish to assert their own identity and reject being fully incorporated into the Russian way of life, culture, and language. Ukraine achieved its independence in the wake of World War I. Well, sort of. Maybe not fully. Ukrainian lands became a battleground of different states with conflicting ideas. The internationally recognized Ukrainian People's Republic has the upper ground, but the Germans, Poles, communists, anarchists, and Russian whites were competing for power in the region. We'll focus on the Russian perspective, which is even divided by ideologies. The Russian whites had control over some parts of Ukraine, but without winning on its home front, they wouldn't win. And eventually, the Bolsheviks under Lenin and Trotsky come up victorious, defeating the Ukrainian People's Republic, the anarchists, the Russian whites, and negotiated the partition of Ukraine with themselves and the Poles. Under the Soviet government, Ukraine became a separate republic, ending the ban on the Ukrainian language and promoting their culture as long as it was approved by the Moscow government. However, there was a spot where things went down: the Holodomor. Even today, this topic remains controversial among Ukrainians and Russians. To simplify, the Holodomor was a terror famine that affected Ukraine, killing millions. It's worth noting that this famine was also widespread in the USSR, but it mainly affected the southern regions. The question that is Holodomor an act of genocide, and if the Soviet government under Stalin deliberately created it, remains a heated topic for debate. But Ukraine and some other countries recognize it as a genocide, while the Soviet government denies its existence. The Great Purge didn't help either. Many Ukrainians fell victim to Stalin's paranoia. These events were a factor in why some Ukrainians saw Hitler as a liberator when the Third Reich invaded the USSR, although it was not the case and Ukraine was subjugated again by the Germans. Despite the controversial events, millions of Ukrainians actually served in the Red Army, and hundreds even became marshals and generals, including Semyon Timoshenko. Some Ukrainians just want to be their own, and many of them joined the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, which fought the Soviets, Poles, and Germans. Even after the war, they continued to fight the Soviet government until they capitulated. Relations improved when Nikita Khrushchev became the new leader of the USSR. He transferred Crimea from Russia to Ukraine, which certainly would not cause any problems, isn't it? And he emphasized the quote-unquote friendship between Ukrainian and Russian nations. Ukraine developed significantly during this period and became an important center, not just in agriculture and industry, but in arms production, high-tech research, and culture. When the Soviet Union's existence was questioned, Ukraine supported the New Union Treaty, which would reform the Soviet Union but moved towards independence after the August coup, which Moscow accepted nevertheless. Ukraine's modern relationship with Russia is not all bad. There are periods where it's pretty good, and there are periods where it has gotten to a new low. By the early 1990s, there were some issues, such as the Soviet nuclear arsenal left within Ukrainian soil, in which theoretically could be Ukrainian now. Having nukes would certainly make a foreign invasion a suicide mission, but the problem is that Ukraine didn't have the means to operate and launch them. Plus, Ukraine's economy is at a free fall and no one is comfortable with Ukraine having nukes. As a result, the Budapest Memorandum and Security Assurances made sure that the territorial integrity of Ukraine, as well as Kazakhstan and Belarus, would be respected, for now, and that they would either destroy the leftover nukes or transfer them to Russia. Russia was seen as a friendly neighbor, by the way, at that time, so they trusted Russia. Another issue is Crimea. No, not that thing, but the Black Sea Fleet and the operating bases in the peninsula. But fortunately, Ukraine and Russia had an agreement concerning that, and they even signed the Ukrainian-Russian Friendship Treaty in 1997, in which they promised to respect their territorial integrity and continue to be strategic partners. Before 2014, Russo-Ukrainian relations fluctuated a lot, but were still manageable. During the latter years of Leonid Kuchma, relations with Russia improved, but during the Russo-Georgian War, Ukraine was accused of supporting Georgia, harming its ties with Russia. When Viktor Yanukovych became president, he pushed Ukraine further into Russia. The groundwork for potential conflict is Ukraine's internal division. Not everyone in Ukraine is on the same page. For instance, those living in Western Ukraine are generally pro-West, and they seek integration into Western institutions, such as the European Union and NATO. Those living in the East are generally much closer to Russia, and they welcome Ukraine's closer relationship and partnership with Russia. Those living in the East also have more Russian speakers than those in the West. Kiev serves as the middle point, and that's why each Kiev government has differing views concerning the West and Russia. The status quo would be shattered, however, when Viktor Yanukovych's pro-Russian policies and his suspension of the EU Association Agreement served as the final straw for the fiercely pro-West Ukrainians, and they revolted. The ousting of Viktor Yanukovych and the rise of Petro Poroshenko is also considered a final straw for Russia and the pro-Russians in Ukraine. Hence, Russia annexed Crimea, and the pro-Russians took up arms and declared the breakaway republics of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic with an intention to join Russia. The fighting was brutal and destabilizing Relations only got worse when Russia and Ukraine would set up policies that cancel the other side, mainly Ukraine kind of barring pro-Russian things, which ranges from trade to military and cultural ties. Even though there was a ceasefire agreement between Ukraine and the breakaway states, fighting goes on after this day. And here we arrive in the recent headlines. As of February 14, 2022, many sources claim that Russia is going on an all-out assault in Ukraine, but they currently deny it. But the question and the motives of Russia's general actions in Ukraine since 2014 can be answered by the next factor: geopolitics. Ukraine sits in the greater European plain, in which the Russian heartland also belongs. In Russia, security is the number one priority. Despite being the largest country on earth, Russia wants to keep its territorial integrity because, well, with great power comes great responsibility. So why go after Ukraine? Well, the answer to that is that the Kiev government is currently being friendly with the West, particularly to the EU and especially NATO. Ukraine becoming a NATO member would threaten Russia's territorial integrity, and for them, is unacceptable. But why does Russia consider NATO a threat? Well, NATO is dominated by the United States, and it all brings back memories of the Cold War. Having another NATO member on the doorstep would mean Russia has to increase their military spending, which is again unacceptable. But there's more to that. For many, Ukraine derives from the Slavic word that means borderland. And for Russia, it's kind of true. For many times, most foreign powers that threatened or invaded Russia usually came through Ukraine. The Turks and the Crimean Tatars, the Germans during World War I, and the Germans again during World War II, in which they almost cut off Russia from the Black Sea and the North Caucasus if only Stalingrad had capitulated. If that happened, Russia would lose access to the Black Sea, and their economy instability would crumble. Today, Russia would not necessarily want to conquer Ukraine, but to comply with their security demands and have a more friendly government and political system that will benefit Moscow. In Kiev's point of view, Russia is seen as an aggressive country that violated their territorial integrity, and they seek to look for friends that would help Kiev against Russia and the pro-Russian rebels, which happens to be NATO. This is not just exclusive to Ukraine though. Russia has also issued security demands to NATO themselves, and many of the NATO members, such as the Baltic states, can be a potential threat in the eyes of Moscow. It just happened that Ukraine became a major geopolitical chessboard between NATO and Moscow. As of the uploading of this video, the question of whether Russia will invade is up for speculation. But if Russia did invade, geopolitical realities might change depending on the outcome of the potential invasion. As mentioned, Ukraine and Russia are currently hostile to each other due to their history and current geopolitics. In Ukraine, views on Russia generally depend on what they stand for. Many of the pro-West nationalists, even the government, despise Russia due to several historical events just like the Holodomor and the fact that they were under the rule of Moscow for many centuries, and they stress that Russia violated their territorial integrity, and they accuse Russia of supporting pro-Russian separatists in Donbass. Pro-Russians in Ukraine and some in Russia accuses Ukraine of being Russophobic, and they deny the Holodomor as a genocide, and they sometimes accuse them of being fascist. The separatists also wish to join Russia even though Russia had different plans. When it comes to Russia, the Moscow government doesn't like Ukraine becoming an even potential NATO member. Somehow, some in Russia still see Ukraine as a brother, but under the chains of Western institutions, and they believe they must free Ukraine from that and bring them back into the Russian sphere. However, it's not all bad. There are periods where Ukraine and Russia are strategic partners. Russians and Ukrainians can become friends on a personal level, and some even intermarry. In a broader scope, Russians and Ukrainians can root to the Kievan Rus, and both of them are East Slavic people. The reality is that the Russian-Ukrainian relationship is incredibly complicated, and it's not a one-sided linear thing. There are multiple factors. People from Ukraine and Russia may have different views of what their government says. Will peace happen between these two countries? Hard to say. But the status quo will have to be broken, either in Russia or Ukraine's favor. If war did happen, it can be used to settle political disputes, despite this escalation. Even then, some people despise the other side in all spheres. What is sure though, that unfortunately, more lives are going to be lost as this conflict is still ongoing. This video attempts to explain and provide the context of Russian-Ukraine hostility on both sides. And if there are corrections, feel free to do so. Please subscribe for more country neighbors.